This Prism might just be remastered. For those of us who love music, there's the constant debate between the crackle and hiss of analog music that one can hear on vinyl and the more pristine but much less rich sound that we get on digital. Now, with advances in neuro-feedback techniques, the signal-to-noise ratio of the brain may also be remastered. To explain, we're joined by Dr. Stephen LaConte. He's an assistant professor at the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. LaConte.
Thanks for having me.
I have to admit that the work you're doing has a little bit of mad scientist about it. You're involved in developing a new technology that can convert thought into action. What does that mean in real terms or in real applications?
Well, what we're trying to do is push the limits of the information that we can decode from the brain, and can we use that then to control brain-computer interfaces or external devices? So can we move a cursor around on the screen or control a robot hand remotely? And so one of the really neat things about using real-time fMRI to do this is that we get access to the entire brain, but we also get access to what would normally be thought to be covert thoughts or tasks that we do in our head.
That's one of the first things that comes to mind, which is almost anything we do has many, many steps which are unconscious. So what level of linguistic sophistication, neurologic linguistic sophistication, do we have to understand in order to be able to get that robot arm to lift a pencil or just to move a cursor?
That's a good question, and I think it's a largely unanswered question. I can talk a little bit about the approaches that we're using. We're trying to use state-of-the-art machine learning techniques to decode the state of the brain, if you will. But our definition of states are relatively coarse, and we often have to revert back to some sort of behavioral measure to kind of tie that in. So in this particular study, we were looking at, just to kind of make it concrete, we were looking at two different rates of covert speech. So subjects were asked to come into the scanner, and they were counting, so that's a fairly automatic task. They were native English speakers. And we were trying to see if we could decode slow counting from fast counting. Now, whether or not that's pushing the limits of what we can get neurologically, it's hard to tell. But we would like to start looking at subconscious components of action, such as motor planning or those sorts of things. The reason we were doing fast versus slow counting is that it turns out that rate of speech is a very important diagnostic tool in speech therapy and in neurology. And so there's a fancy term for how quickly you can produce syllables like pa-ta-ka, if you wanted to do pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa. And that's called the diacokinetic rate of speech. And so in some disorders such as dysarthria, that's compromised. And one tool for speech therapists then is to look at rate of speech as a potential coaching point to enhance clarity. So if you can slow down speech, which seems like it would be easy, but it's actually hard for us to slow down our own speech, that gives you a little bit more time for motor planning, but also for the listener, it gives them more time to process speech that may not be complying with what they're expecting.
I'd imagine it also would have certain advantages later on in terms of diagnostic approaches, because if you know what the brain should be doing when you're asking it to do this task, whether it is to generate a phoneme quickly or slowly, you know what's happening if people are having difficulty speaking, say after a stroke, right?
That's right. And so there are several reasons that we went with covert rate of speech. But one in particular, since you mentioned stroke, was that there's a small but emerging literature that is of the opinion that covert practice might be useful because it reduces overt commission of errors, but it also reduces frustration. But if you can learn to vividly imagine the task that you want to do, whether it be speech or some other motor-related task like grasping, if you can practice that covertly, you can do it with less frustration and do it repeatedly. many more times.
And let's talk about the tool that you're using. You said you're using an fMRI.
Yeah,
What
that's
is
right.
that, and how finely is it able to look inside our brain?
Well, real-time fMRI is what I'm using, and that's at the crux using magnetic resonance imaging, but in a way that essentially take a movie of the brain in action. And so the resolution for kind of a standard fMRI protocol right now, as of 2013, is roughly using a 3 by 3 by 3 millimeter cube voxel and sampling at about once every 2 seconds. And so, of course, you can push the extremes on those numbers, and some groups are doing that, but there's always a trade-off in terms of resolution or sampling time. And then further, we're limited by the actual signal that we're measuring, which is not a direct neural signal, but a neural correlate, hemodynamic changes or vascular changes in the brain that are coupled with neural metabolism.
What populations will benefit most from this work as of right now, and certainly as you project out into the future?
Well, we think that we've developed a method that's broadly applicable, and so we're trying to actually broadly apply it. But a couple of grants that we've received in this area have been from the Department of Defense, looking at traumatic brain injury, as well as NIH, NIDA, specifically in the NIAAA, which is the alcohol branch of the NIH. So we've been looking at addiction and traumatic brain injury, primarily populations of interest, as well as speech rehabilitation.
Just because we're in this week where the government has shut down, I should ask, does it concern you that some of your grants may be delayed because of certain NIH people being non-essential? How much trouble will this cause you?
Sequester itself has already affected most of us with federal funding. We just received a grant from NIAAA, but it was cut automatically before we received it by a fairly significant fraction of the total funding. So, I think spending for science and technology, for health as well as for basic science applications is really critical for the long-term health of the country. It's something that's made the United States great historically, being at the cutting edge, the forefront of all technologies. And, it's an investment that pays off. I think other countries are doing a great job, and we should, use them as a model.
And in order to walk into the land of science fiction, it often takes a constant presence with money and research and backing and the cooperation of lots of institutions. So hopefully you will get that support.
That's right. And, a lot of what I do tries to balance developing technology, but also translating it quickly into applications that will hopefully help society. But I'm a big proponent in basic research as well. And so even though I'm trying to translate what I'm doing, I'm using as a foundation the vast work of lots of people that have built up technology over time. And the fact is that science can take you in places where you can't really predict in advance. And so having a portfolio of basic research as well as something that's going to pay off in a short time span, both of those are good for a country to be investing in.
Learning how to remaster the mind and remaster our scientific development. I'm Andrew Hiller for the Prism, and I've been joined by Dr. Stephen LaConte. He's an assistant professor at the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute. Thank you for your time and your work.
Thank you very much.